The Rite of Spring is a ballet with dramatic characters and a narrative arc. Although it is usually performed as a concert piece, its meaning is deeply bound up with its dramatic scenario. At the same time, the music itself creates meanings. Its musical meanings are many-layered, often ambiguous, sometimes self-contradictory, always difficult to tease out. It's always like that with music. Every feature of the music, including its form, texture, melody, harmony, rhythm, and timbre, conveys meaning. The expressive dimension of this music has many different aspects, including familiar topics like fanfare and march, but extending far beyond them. Let's start with the ballet scenario. Stravinsky devised the scenario, the basic dramatic plan, in collaboration with an artist and archaeologist named Nicholas Rurik, widely considered at the time to be the foremost authority on pagan prehistoric Russia. Stravinsky and Rurik mapped out a series of loosely connected scenes associated with the coming of spring, and culminating in the sacrifice of a young woman to propitiate the sun god. The ballet they envisioned would depict a primitive, pre-literate, pre-agricultural people engaged in a celebration of spring. Here is the plan they devised: a ballet in two large parts, each divided into 6 or 7 scenes. In some cases, the scenes are further divided into named sections. The choreography for the 1913 premiere of the ballet was by Václav Nijinsky. Although Stravinsky later criticized Nijinsky's choreography harshly, he was deeply involved in shaping it during the long period of rehearsal before the premiere, and, like the scenario, the choreography is an indispensable starting point for any discussion of musical meaning. The problem is that Nijinsky's choreography was used only a few times before it fell into complete obscurity and disuse for more than 50 years, until the choreographer Millicent Hodson attempted a reconstruction in 1987. The Hodson-Nijinsky choreography has been performed widely in the years since, and I will be making constant reference to it. But while it is as close as we are likely to come to the dance as Stravinsky imagined and witnessed it in 1913, it cannot be taken as perfectly accurate. Too much information has been lost in the intervening years. It will frame our discussion, but as with the scenario, the relationship between choreography and music is complex, and the music makes meanings on its own terms. As a central icon of musical modernism, the Rite represents a sustained assault on custom, habit, and convention, the norms that previously had governed musical behavior. Its radical discontinuity with historical models is reflected in its internal form, which is broken, splintered into blocks, shattering traditional canons of continuity. Its textures are stratified into discrete and often conflicting layers, a symbolic division of musical consciousness and perspective. Its harmonies are shockingly and aggressively dissonant. Its rhythms consistently undermine the metrical regularities of earlier music in a continual process of arousing and thwarting listener expectations. In all of these ways, the music refuses to indulge the fantasy of harmonious wholeness and health that had previously shaped musical aesthetics. Instead, the Rite's music embodies an aesthetics of disability, finding in shattered forms, discordant harmonies, and jagged rhythms new sources of beauty and musical power. Like the sounding body of the music, the ways that body moves through musical time and space also shatter conventional norms. Instead of moving purposefully toward goals, the music meanders and wanders. Its mobility appears to be impaired. The harmonies oscillate. The melodies stutter and remain enclosed within narrow frames. The pervasive ostinatos enforce a sense of fixity. The music is trapped within a narrow enclosure. Musical mobility is impaired by a pervasive sense of weight and heaviness. The melodies in their wandering course are mostly directed downward, endlessly descending, and they often carry a heavy burden of parallel planing. The chords are often thickly scored with smaller intervals and dissonant intervals down low. In its weightedness, its spasmodic movements, and its fractured, fragmentary forms, the music resonates with Nijinsky's choreography. The dancers hold their bodies in unnatural ways and move with angular jerks in a heavy, earthbound, downward directed manner. In all of this, we see and hear what Albright calls the kinesthetics of the Neolithic body. The Neolithic mind seems also to be at issue in its radical simplification of musical materials and its incessant repetition of them. The music conveys a sense of intellectual limitation of a primitive folk moving and thinking within a very narrow compass. Roughly speaking, there are two ways of thinking about the passage of time, especially musical time. Time is a circle, an endless loop, always moving back toward its starting point, ritualistic rather than evolutionary. Time is an arrow, directed purposefully toward goals. Both of these temporalities are evident in the rite, but the circular, ritualistic approach is much more pervasive. In its refusal to move in the traditionally fluent way toward distant goals, the music embodies an idea of time as a circle. Instead of growth, development, and evolution, we hear fixity and stasis, with the music endlessly turning back on itself. The melodies repeat short fragments within fixed frames. In the ostinatos, every ending leads right to a new beginning and another repetition. Many of the scenes end with the same music they began with, and the final movements of the ballet recall its opening, although in a radically different expressive context. Even in scenes that build to shattering cacophonous climaxes of accumulation, with tunes and ostinato patterns proliferating, the result is always a musical impasse and a rapid dissolution to an earlier musical state. In all of these ways, the music circles back on itself, denying the possibility of growth or change. The choreography reflects the musical and dramatic circularity in its literal gathering of the dancers into circles. Many of the scenes are explicitly designed as circle dances, and the entire sacrificial dance at the end involves the rapacious old men circling around their sacrificial victim. The temporal circularity operates in various dimensions: the hours of a day, the seasons of a year, the stages of a human life, the stages of human history. Although this is not explicit in the scenario, the rite appears to unfold within a sort of mythical time, a single 24-hour day from dawn through morning, afternoon, evening, and night, back to the moment before dawn. Each of the two parts of the rite can also be understood as taking place over the course of a 4-season year, starting just before spring, passing through summer, autumn, and winter, and ending just before the next spring. Each of the two parts can also be understood metaphorically to trace the stages of a human life, from birth through adolescence and adulthood, old age, and death, to a symbolic rebirth. In relation to the stages of human history, however, there is no such movement, either circular or directed. Rather, the drama imagines this particular early stage in human history as fixed, static, non-evolving, a permanent present. We can take our chart of the scenes of the ballet and begin to flesh it out with the time of day, the time of year, and the time of life. A single daily cycle from dawn to dawn, 2 seasonal cycles, one in each of the two parts of the ballet, and 2 cycles of life, again, one in each of the two parts of the ballet. The music and the drama have two basic ways of articulating and representing space: upward toward the sky, with rising physical motions and ascending musical motions, and downward toward the earth, with falling physical motions and descending musical motions. While there are many crucial moments in the drama that are directed upward, the sage's upward gaze toward the sky just before he kisses the earth, the lifting of the chosen one's dead body at the very end of the ballet, most of the activity, both musical and choreographic, is directed downward. In the choreography, the dancers often move with a heavy tread, as though burdened, and their movements are directed downward rather than embodying the classical balletic ideals of soaring lines in defiance of gravity, and the dancers often fall to the ground. In the music, the idea of falling is particularly pertinent. The harmonies are often weighted toward the lower registers, giving them a clotted, dark, dissonant character. The melodies are usually directed downward, often moving repeatedly through their narrow frames from top to bottom. These musical falls evoke the biblical fall from a pastoral Eden, the natural world, into a human world of strife and death. The ballet deploys four groups of dramatic characters. The first group consists of girls or young women, including the chosen one. Sometimes they are girls, as in Augurs of Spring. Sometimes they are fully sexualized young women, as in Dance of the Earth. Usually their expressive mode is pastoral, but they sometimes get dragged unwillingly into the military mode, and they participate willingly in the wild dances that conclude both Part 1 and Part 2. The second group of characters consists of boys or young men. They are boys in Augurs of Spring, as they learn augury, but they are fully sexualized men in the later scenes of Part 1. They are entirely absent from Part 2, which is devoted to the young women and the old men. Their expressive mode is primarily military, often expressed through fanfares, hunting calls, and marches. The third group of characters is a group of one, the old woman. She appears on stage only early in Part 1, although her exotic tritone-based chromatic music returns in her absence late in Part 2. She is understood musically as an exotic character, superhuman in her age and her divining ability. The fourth group of characters is a group of old men, the sage, the elders, the ancestors. They are the embodiment of patriarchal power. Their expressive mode is usually religious, with formal processions and chorale textures. We can again flesh out our chart of the scenes of the ballet, now to include the characters who dance those scenes. The music of the Rite of Spring engages four expressive modes or registers: the pastoral, the military, the religious, and the wild dance. Although the boundaries between these modes are not always clear, and they may intermingle to some extent, most of the scenes, or the larger sections of scenes when these are highly individuated, can be ascribed to one of the four. In that sense, each scene is thus a movement, both in the sense of a symphonic movement and in the sense of a set of characteristic gestures, motions, and musical actions. Symbolically and dramatically, the pastoral is associated with nature and the sights and sounds of the natural world. In the pastoral mode, it is springtime. The ice cracks and melts. New greenery emerges from the earth. People move outside from their cold weather confinement. It is a time of fertility, of renewal, and rebirth. It is thus an expressive mode associated with the female, including the traditional linkage of women with fertility and birth, and with time's periodicity and circularity. It is also associated with the night, its mystery, irrationality, and enchantment. The pastoral mode is manifested musically in the sounds of the natural world, such as birdsong, and in the sound of shepherds' pipes, the dudki, to which Stravinsky refers in letters describing the ballet's opening scene. The instrumentation features solo winds. The ambient sound world skews toward the diatonic. The melodies often imitate folk styles of cantillation, with frequent grace notes. There may be an absence of steady rhythmic pulsation and a sense of rhythmic haziness in the manner of night music. Scenes in pastoral mode may be circular in design. They end where they begin. Symbolically and dramatically, the military mode is associated with young men engaged in combat or symbolic combat. Hypermasculinity and violence against women are among its defining traits. The musical manifestations of the military mode include some traditional musical topics, including march, hunt, and fanfare. While the pastoral emphasizes solo winds, the military deploys massed brass and percussion, including non-percussion instruments used percussively. Tempos are strict, with steady, sharply articulated rhythmic pulsation. The harmonic ambience is often mixed octatonic and diatonic. The form of military-oriented scenes tends to be accumulative, a gradual buildup of layers toward a climax, directed rather than circular. Symbolically and dramatically, the religious mode is associated with old people, the old woman, the sage, the elders, and the ancestors. These figures are superhuman, above the crowd of young men and women. The old woman has the gift of divination, and the sage and elders are the religious priests, the leaders of the spring rites. Musically, this expressive mode manifests as chant, ritual, procession, and chorale, usually in slow tempos with shifting meter. The rite has two wild dances, the dance of the earth at the end of part 1, and the sacrificial dance at the end of part 2. The dance of the earth is an orgiastic dance of life. The sacrificial dance is a dance of death. The sacrificial dance draws on the older tradition of the danse macabre, based on an allegory dating to the Middle Ages of the inevitable triumph of death. This is a dance that leads to the grave. The same expressive mode also penetrates into other scenes, especially the naming and honoring of the chosen one. These dances represent the end or before the beginning of civilization, with its sense of restraint and decorum. These are savage, violent, animalistic descents into either unrestrained sexuality or death. If the religious mode has something of a spiritual aspiration upward toward the superhuman, these wild dances mark frenzied, mad descents into the subhuman, the bestial. They also convey a sense of fate or fatality. If the pastoral is marked by gentle circularity of form, these wild dances are marked by a sense of inexorable forward movement toward an inescapable fate, with a corresponding accumulation of textural layers. The whole orchestra plays in these dances, tutti, the crowd rather than solely the individual. Percussion and brass are dominant. The ambient sound world is often based on the whole tone scale. Here is a summary of the 4 expressive modes. These 4 modes tend to occur in a particular order, and each of the 2 parts of the ballet follows the same trajectory: pastoral, military, religious, wild dance. These 2 cycles of expressive modes correspond to the 2 cycles of the 4-season year and the stages of human life, all unfolding within a single 24-hour day, a daytime cycle and a nighttime cycle. With these temporal cycles and expressive modes in mind, let's undertake a brief survey of the entire ballet, scene by scene, to get a sense of the larger dramatic arc. The ballet starts with an instrumental introduction. The stage is empty and dark. The time of day is just before sunrise. The time of year is just before spring. The time of life is just before birth. We find ourselves in the pastoral expressive mode amid sounds of the natural world, with folk-like melodies, shepherd's pipes, and bird calls. The curtain goes up and everything changes, from the darkness before dawn to morning, from the end of winter to the beginning of spring, and from birth to youth. The stage is populated by young boys who dance in a march-like military mode. An old woman enters with her own somewhat exotic music to instruct them in augury. A bit later in the same scene, the young girls enter with their own distinctive music. It is still morning, still early in the spring, still with the focus on young human characters. The military expressive mode prevails, but the presence of the young girls bends it toward the pastoral. By the time of the following scene, the ritual of abduction begins, it is full bright daytime in summer. The adolescent boys and girls have become mature, fully sexualized young men and young women. The scene is dominated by the men. Indeed, it is a scene of sexual violence directed by them against the women. The expressive mode is military, marked by fanfares, marches, and hunting calls. On a bright day in midsummer, Spring Rounds puts the young women back in control. They enact a circle dance, the circularity emblematic of both the feminine and the pastoral, amid lyrical melodies, solo winds, and high registers. Still on a bright midsummer day, the men are back on center stage engaging in mock combat in their ritual of two rival tribes. The women entreat the men to moderate their violence, and their music is relatively gentle and lyrical, but the expressive mode of the scene remains military. The old men, the sage and the elders, arrive on stage and everything changes. Now it is evening in the autumn, marking the shift from youth to old age. The ambience is now more religious than military. It's a religious procession. The music is built in complex rhythmic layers, conveying a sort of primitive learned style befitting the oldest and wisest of the tribe. This is the final scene of part one, and the temporal cycles reach a conclusion. The end of the daylight hours, the end of the symbolic year, and the end of a lifetime as the men and women lose themselves and their shared humanity in a wild, orgiastic, animalistic dance. This scene also concludes the first cycle of expressive modes, pastoral to military to religious, and now a wild dance. When part two begins, these cycles will begin again also. Part one took place during the daytime from dawn through late evening. Part two begins in darkness and lasts until dawn. The stage is dark and empty, just as it was in the introduction to part one. We begin the second seasonal cycle, just before spring, and the second life cycle, starting just before birth. The expressive mode is pastoral and feminine, dark and hazy, with solo winds, high registers, and lyrical melodies. In Stravinsky's description, this scene involves young virgins dancing in circles on the sacred hill. It is nighttime in the early spring, and the young women dance alone. The expressive mode is pastoral in a feminized, dramatic, and musical space. Now it is midnight in summertime. The peaceful, mystical young women have become Amazonian warriors who menace the chosen one, the sacrificial victim. The women have appropriated the military expressive mode, usually associated with the men, amid fanfares and hunting calls. Now we're into the early morning hours after midnight, and the season is autumnal. The focus shifts to the old men, the sage elders and ancestors. The expressive mode has also shifted from pastoral or military to religious amid a hymn-like or chant-like religious procession. It is still nighttime in autumn, and the focus remains on the old men, the sage, the elders, and the ancestors, as they encircle the chosen one. The expressive mode is religious, a solemn, somewhat exoticized, march-like religious procession. The final scene of the ballet, the sacrificial dance, brings the completion of various temporal and expressive cycles. The time of day is again just before dawn, as in the introduction to part 1. The time of year is late winter, just before spring, again, as in the introduction to part 1. And we are in the presence of death, the ritual murder of the chosen one. Part 2 concludes, as did part 1, with a wild frenzied dance. It marks the end of the second cycle of expressive modes, pastoral, military, religious, and finally a wild dance. At the end of the ballet, we will find numerous musical references to the introduction to part 1, but in a radically transformed expressive environment.